Good evening. This evening for your homework, we're going to be looking at the North and South advantages again, and we're also going to take a look at a timeline of major events in the Civil War. So hopefully you'll remember what it is that we talked about in class today, about how both sides were almost evenly matched, and as we continue our study of the Civil War, you're going to see that it truly seemed like the South might have had the advantage, and they started off really well and almost won the war there for a little while. So sit back, relax, but don't relax too much. Get out your paper and let's get started. As I said, let's review the North and the South and their strengths before we move on to our timeline. So let's start off with the North. The North had 23 states on its side, and you can look at the map down here and refresh your memory. Remember, those red ones are those border states. They also had about 2/3 of the population of the United States in those 23 states. The North had lots of soldiers that they could recruit, and that helped them have a very large army. The next thing is that they had a better railroad system. This came in handy when they needed to resupply the military, and it allowed the northern troops to have those supplies wherever they were. Now, they also were an industrial area, as you remember, and this meant that they had better weapons, better uniforms, ammunition, and even better shoes, which can make a big difference when you're having to do a lot of walking, and that made their military very strong. And the last advantage was that the North was fighting to keep the Union together and to abolish slavery, and these are two strong beliefs that are rooted in patriotism and in their own morals, and those can be very strong things for people to be dealing with. Now, let's take a look at the South and their strengths. The South had almost all of the military academies in the United States down in that area, and so therefore they had the majority of the nation's military leaders on their side. One of these men, Robert E. Lee, was considered one of the best military officers of that time. The South also knew that the area where they were fighting, they were very familiar with it because that's where they lived, and most of the battles took place in the South. So they knew where the best ground was, where the best places to hide were, where the roads were, where to get water, and other things. And this advantage is the same advantage that we used against Great Britain in the Revolutionary War, so both sides knew that this was a really big deal. Oh, went back too far. Sorry about that. Another point was that the South was an agricultural society. Now, having to work on a farm made these men very strong, and they were used to that physical labor. And so that meant they were used to all the things that they were going to have to do when it came time to walk for miles, to carry the heavy equipment, to work for a long time. And the South had a very strong army, physically strong. And then finally, the South was fighting for states' rights and for their way of life. And that's a powerful motivator, to think that if you lose, your entire life will change. And so the South was very strongly adamant, or they were very emotionally invested in this war. Now we can move on. Let's look at our timeline. I am not in any way going to expect for you to remember all of these details. In fact, I'm going to talk about some things that I'm not even going to put up on the screen. So I want you to pay attention, but only the things that are on the screen are the things that you need to put on your worksheet. I'll also put them on the bottom, at the bottom down here, where I can type things in, just to reinforce what it is exactly that I want you to write on your worksheet and to remember. Well, let's start with these two events. In April 1861, we have Fort Sumter, which we studied about. Confederate troops fired on Fort Sumter, South Carolina, And this event was the start of our war. And you can see the picture there of Fort Sumter. The second event that I want you to look at is that in July of that same year, the first major battle of the Civil War takes place at Bull Run. Now, this is the first battle at Bull Run. Apparently, they decided to fight there twice. This was a really brutal battle and one that the Union lost. This was a wake-up call to the Union. They realized that the Confederate Army was not going to just lay down and give up. Now, the next event that's not on your screen, but I want you to kind of have in your mind, is that in March of 1862, there were two large ships, and these ships were called ironclads. They fought each other. One was for the North, the other for the South. They were the USS Monitor and the USS Virginia, and this fight went on, and nobody won. It ended in a draw. Another event that I want you to remember is the battle at Antietam. This happened in September of 1862, and in Antietam, there were 26,000 casualties. That's a lot of casualties in one battle. The victory belonged to the Union here, and this was a really important victory because the Union hadn't won any major battles yet, and this victory forced General Lee, who had started to go back to go into the North for these battles, to stop invading the North and head back to the South. Now, the next event, also not on your timeline, and you can hear someone's alarm going off, is in January of 1863. Abraham Lincoln, after we won the battle at Antietam, decided he was ready to give the Emancipation Proclamation. And so January 1863, this document stated that all slaves in the Union or in the Confederacy were free. Now, because of this, a lot of the slaves moved to the North and joined the Union Army, where they were insured for their freedom, and they wanted to support the war. Now, back to your timeline that you're filling out on your worksheet. This next event happened in July 1863, and it was the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, this battle is called the turning point in the war. It was a very horrible battle. The Union won this battle, but at a great cost. There were a lot of casualties in this battle, too. This battle weakened the Confederacy, and their army was hurt so badly that there was really no way that they could recover after this point, but they weren't ready to give up yet, so they kept fighting. So I need you to remember that the Battle of Gettysburg was the turning point in the war. Now, another battle that you're going to put on your timeline actually happened for a long time, but it ended the day after the Battle of Gettysburg. And this was the surrender at Vicksburg. And Vicksburg is in Mississippi. The battle went on for 40 days. Non-stop cannon fire from the Union on to Gettysburg. And Gettysburg was sort of a fortified city. And it just couldn't hold up anymore. And so Vicksburg was given up, and it was given to the Union. And Vicksburg was down, like I said, in Mississippi. It's right on the Mississippi River, and so this gave the Union some power on the Mississippi. Our next slide shows us your next event. November of 1863, President Abraham Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address. This is one of the most famous speeches of any president. He took 2 minutes to address the crowd at Gettysburg, and he dedicated the National Cemetery to those that died fighting and inspired the North to keep going and win the war, all in the same speech. 2 minutes. You can say a whole lot. Our next thing on your timeline, I want to tell you some things that happened in between November and April here. In September of 1864, the Union Army captured Atlanta, Georgia. This isn't on your timeline, but I wanted you to know that General Sherman marched into Atlanta. He took over the city. He evacuated it, and then he burned it to the ground. Just a little later in November, President Lincoln is elected to his second term as president. Then in April of 1865, which is here on your screen and goes on your timeline, General Lee surrenders to General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, and this is the end of the Civil War. These two gentlemen decided they were done fighting, and they ended the Civil War. General Lee was a gentleman, and he surrendered in a very gentlemanly way, which you don't always see at the end of a war like this. And they were able to meet together and come to terms with their peace. And our last event on your timeline, only 5 days later, President Abraham Lincoln is assassinated on April in 1865, and that actually happened on April 14th. He was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth while he was at the theater with his wife, and he was one of the most beloved and admired presidents of all time, and he died of these wounds before he could see the South restored. Now, I know that that's a lot of information that I've just given to you, but the reason why I've done that is because when you know what order things go in, sometimes it helps for things to make sense. There are going to be some of those timeline type events on tests, the SOL, on your quizzes that you might have. So you need to have a general idea as to which things come first, second, and third. For instance, you might need to know that Abraham Lincoln was elected president, and then the South seceded, and then we have the Battle of Fort Sumter, and then after Fort Sumter we have the first Bull Run. So things like that, just generally speaking, you kind of need to know what order they go in. So don't stress out. Make sure you get all this information in your timeline. You might have to go back and watch the video again because you do have questions to answer as well. And just take this as a big picture, as a snapshot of everything that you need to know. In next week's videos, we're going to be talking about our two presidents, the President of the Union and the President of the Confederacy, and we're also going to talk about the two major generals, and we're going to be comparing them. So I look forward to seeing you in video and in person very soon, and y'all have a good night. Bye.